Yeah, so strategic development funding, and in 2013-14, since 2014, 176.7 million pounds, 176.7 million has been awarded to dioceses for missional projects. It's an unprecedented investment by a national church in the idea of the re-evangelization of the nation. And I think that's quite important to note, actually. It's an unprecedented investment by a national church in the idea, the possibility of the re-evangelization of the nation. That's true. And significantly, for the purposes of this conference, of that 180 million pounds or so, at least 82.7 million, about 47%, was specifically designated for the starting of new churches. Again, this is a massive investment, almost comprehensive across the church, in one idea, that in response to decline, starting new things is a good thing to be doing. So what we wanted to do at the centre was to explore some of the theological issues and questions that are emerging from this substantive missional activity and investment. That's what this report is doing. In what follows, I want to take us through the basic form of the report. Okay, so first of all, very brief word on approach and method, in other words, the research that we did, before moving on to some findings, and then from which emerged 4 key theological areas to explore. So a bit on method and approach, bit on some findings, and then on some 4 theological themes that emerged. And I want to give probably most time to those 4 theological themes, because that's what we're here to do. So method and approach. This research is a piece of theological research into the activity of starting new churches within 11 dioceses in the Church of England. There's 42 dioceses in the Church of England. We researched 11. We see the research as a piece of theological empirical research as limited in the report. We say about 5 ways, and you can read about the methodology and the approach in the report. I'm not going to bore you with it tonight, but we see it as limited in significant ways as a piece of sort of empirical research. We've been quite upfront about that. It's limited as empirical research, maybe limited is the wrong word, as a piece of theological empirical research. And by theological, we mean that it's theological in the sense of being primarily about God. Our research was motivated by the question, what might God be doing here? Theology is missiology, which is the work of God in reconciling to himself all things, and ecclesiology. And so we were thinking in terms of what the data reveals about both mission and the church in our context in the UK in the 21st century. We don't shy away from the fact that as a theological piece of research, the empirical work, therefore, has as its driving force the discovery of theological questions and issues. This is to redress what we have perceived to be an overemphasis on praxis when it comes to starting new things. It's been a big theme already of today, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Put simply, this report is a reflection on the theological questions that emerge from the activity in these 11 dioceses. There may well be practical recommendations from this, and we believe that there are some, but these will come through the theological reflection rather than by going around it. These will come through the theological reflection rather than by going around it. And so we spent time focused on finding out about the missional work of the 11 dioceses. We did this through interviews with a key stakeholder in each place, which was a follow-up interview from a questionnaire. We then aligned material from each of these within the data found in publicly accessible reports, statements in each diocese, websites, teaching materials, basically any other data that we could sort of lay our hands upon, and we triangulated that with the interviews that we did in each diocese. So that's the approach and the method. I'm really happy to take questions about that at the end, if you want to talk about that. What did we find? Well, you can have a look on your, there's a handout. I think I had about 40 copies. Hopefully there's enough for everybody. If you want to go online and you can have a look on the report online, encourage you to read that. Ultimately, what I'm going to say tonight is really just a taste of what's in the report itself. So you can go and have a little look. But we grouped our findings into sort of 4 areas or 4 categories. New things started, stuff about language, stuff about the SDF process, and stuff around culture shift. And just for time tonight, I'm going to, and as I've done on the sheet, I've kept together numbers 3 and 4, SDF process and culture shift. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the findings from that, if that's okay. And then we'll give a bit of time for discussion, and then I'll go into the theological themes. So let's start number one with new things started. So what do we find from these 11 dioceses? Well, the headline is that all 11 dioceses had started new things within the 10 years. By the way, just a word on language. We deliberately used that language of new things. We went to the diocese and we said, talk to us about new things. And as you'll see shortly, each of the dioceses had developed their own language, what I call their own ecclesial descriptors to describe what was going on. So we use that language quite deliberately. So it's a very broad term. And unlike other pieces of research like anecdote to evidence and stuff that some of you might be familiar with, we were quite keen not to delineate too tightly that term, as we'll see later on. So all 11 had started new things. Overall, across the 11, there are about 900 new things started. 89% of these 900 new things were integrated within the existing parish system, rather than existing as standalone churches. Anecdotally, so this is what we kept getting, anecdotally, these new things were seen to be growing in perceived contrast to most of the inherited churches in the diocese. These include 40 new resource churches. 8 of the 11 dioceses had started or were about to start resourcing churches. Only 5 of these 900 new things can be said to exist within the Catholic tradition. Come back to that. So the immediate takeaway from the data is that starting new things in the Church of England is extensive and, in terms of diocesan engagement, comprehensive, all 11 dioceses. Ultimately, we shouldn't take the starting of new things lightly. It's worthy of deep theological reflection simply because it's so evidently a core part of the Church of England's ecclesial landscape. The other thing I'll just add is that the data would seem to challenge some frequently voiced concerns around starting new churches in the Church of England. So if you've been part of this debate or even looked on from afar or in your own denomination about new churches and the role of new churches, some of this stuff might be familiar. But first thing to say, the vast majority of these new churches are not city centre resource churches, so larger than 100 people. And most of them don't originate from the likes of HDB, Holy Trinity Brompton. The overwhelming majority of these new churches are not disconnected from the existing parish churches, but are integrated within that system. Looking at the data, we can make a conjecture that the vast majority of these new churches are small and local rather than being big and supra-local. Many of these churches are part of a diocese strategy to redress a perceived failure to engage in areas of material deprivation. What our research doesn't show is whether that endeavour is successful, but it is just important to say that taken as a whole, the movement of starting new things across these 11 dioceses can't be seen, from this data at least, as a project aimed at expanding a middle-class church. The lack of new churches in the Anglo-Catholic tradition will be unsurprising for those of us who have been observing this movement for a long time. This has been and remains essentially an evangelical driven project. So that's the first thing. Second is language. There has been an emergence of a new ecclesial language across the Church of England, what we would call an espoused ecclesiology. And this has happened very quickly. This espoused ecclesiology is affecting an operant theology within the Church of England. That is, this new language is shaping diocese mission and ministry. So say a bit more about that espoused ecclesiology. Each diocese is using what we call a main descriptor for their new things. And there was huge diversity across the 11 as to the, well, I say huge, there's diversity across the 11 as to the terms used. Huge is a statement. Examples include new worshipping communities, new congregations, or new things, or new local communities, or new Christian communities, or worshipping community. And we called that a lack of uniformity in ecclesial terms. There's some similarity, but different dioceses were using different terms. And they were using those terms, as I say, as a main descriptor. In other words, this is what we use in our diocese to make sense of all this stuff that's going on. Only one diocese was working with a designator or a main descriptor that was rooted explicitly in any historic Anglican source. And in that one instance was the 39 Articles. Mixed ecology or mixed economy language is ubiquitous. All 11 dioceses talked about mixed ecology and mixed economy as a way of making sense of this ecclesiology. We had to push really hard to receive any data about fresh expressions. I'll come back to that in a bit. Okay, so that's the language. Third, SCF process and culture shift. All 11 dioceses had engaged with the SCF process. All had received money from Central Church for new missional projects, including starting new things in their diocese. And through the research, there were significant learnings about the impact of that resourcing, and especially as it relates to the integration of that new funding stream into the life of the diocese. So essentially what we found was all of the complexities and interesting conversations were around, you've got a diocese which is very well established to do the thing that the diocese has been doing for however many hundreds of years. And then you bring into that a new funding stream, a whole load of new money. Into that comes often new roles, new responsibilities, and how that new stream fits into the old stream, as it were, is where the interesting conversation lies. But one interesting finding from the research is that it's very difficult to separate the activity of starting new things from the wider strategy, vision, and missional activity of the diocese. They're really linked. In other words, it wasn't just that dioceses were seeking, by receiving this SDF money, to sort of continue as they were going and just doing some church planting on the side, though that could have been what's actually happened. The endeavour from many within the diocese was to sort of change, and this is this language of culture shift, to change what was going on in the diocese itself, to change the sort of attitudes and activity of the diocese. In other words, the activity of starting new things should be seen as one part of a wider missional change in each diocese. In all but one instance, there had been careful thought about what we might call a theory of change in regard to starting new things. And this is where that language of culture change. So 10 out of the 11 spoke quite a lot about culture change, about how starting new things either facilitated or required a culture change if it was to happen. So this is things like when it comes to selection of ministers, deployment of ministers, training of ministers, continuing ministerial development, about the roles of archdeacons and bishops, about things like stipends and housing. If you've got a new model of sort of establishing churches and therefore in some sense a new model of ministry, it has a huge impact in the whole of the diocese, or could have a huge impact. And lots of the stories we were hearing were about some of the complications of that, some of the restrictions where kind of you were hitting a brick wall, if you like, or the individual felt that they're hitting a brick wall in that regard. And there's all sorts of findings about why some of those challenges were occurring, where those sticking points were, why it was difficult within some dioceses to plant churches and not in others, and that kind of thing. So we can find out about that. And I'm not going to say too much about that. So they're the four things. There are a couple of other learnings just to point out, just some interesting things really for us here at this conference. There was some interesting thoughts about new things that have ended, about the lifespan of church plants. That was quite interesting to hear about. Some had ended well, some had ended not so well. This idea that the new things that were started were in some ways inherently vulnerable compared to the established churches, even though some new churches actually, numerically or other measures, seem to be sort of more thriving than inherited churches. They were inherently more vulnerable because structures, buildings, that kind of thing made the smaller thing, the inherited thing, far more secure. There was some information about why new things struggle to get off the ground, the struggle to appoint leaders, a mismatch, as I say, between diocesan plans and vision and the plans and vision of the local leaders, contextual challenges, particularly stuff around housing estates and the challenges of planting into estates, the importance of good interpersonal communication. So the idea that where it was working well in dioceses, it was because essentially there was good person-to-person relationships. So rather than bishop, archdeacon, deference, there was real people talking as real people to real people. A number of dioceses name the fact that starting new things as I said, in estates, areas of deprivation particularly, is difficult, and we give some reasons for that. Okay, so a whole load of stuff from findings, and just in the time we've got, what would be good, I think, is to stop there and just have sort of a couple of minutes probably with people around you, just to reflect on anything there you've heard. And before I move on into the theological themes, for you just to ask me questions that might be about method and approach, just because you think I don't actually understand what this report is doing, or it might be about some of the findings you want to get to know. So just a couple of minutes, and then I'll take a few questions. So to dig into the theological themes that emerged, and I guess the reports we're working on, this model might change, but essentially what I guess we've been doing is some empirical work, and then out of that comes some theological thinking that hopefully poses good questions, ask the right questions, And that's the same with the shorter report, the Four Churches in Durham Diocese report that you can read about. Similar things, some empirical work, some theological themes emerge. So 1, 2, 3, 4 theological themes that we're going to look at tonight together. And I want to spend a bit of time here. So language, vision, strategy and culture, resourcing church, pioneers and planters. So language, vision, strategy and culture, resourcing church, pioneers and planters. So I'll start with language. There is growing variety in the designators used for new things in the Church of England. And this is significant because these designators are really, as I said, the espoused ecclesiology of the diocese. They're both illustrative and shaping of an ecclesiology. That the term church, for example, is not used in favour of other terms, such as community, congregation, etc., is, I think, worthy of theological reflection. We explore whether the question, what is church, is worth asking. So, as I say, almost all the dioceses had chosen a descriptor that allowed, really, the goal was to allow for breadth in ecclesial form. It functioned as a blanket term. In this sense, the language is related to what I said was the ubiquitous use of mixed economy or mixed ecology language. Dioceses were being really careful to over-define these new things, since to do so would be to limit the possibilities. The language also serves to hold together potentially disparate realities, connecting, for example, new and old, pioneer, planted, and inherited. So if you think about a phrase like Christian community, it transcends that old-new divide. It works for both. There are at least 2 deeper questions I think we should ask at the implications of this trend. First, what might it mean for the Church of England to have substantive variety in its ecclesial definitions across its dioceses? In other words, does this really matter? Second, what might it mean that the language of church is not used here and has become subsumed within other descriptors? And actually, as I was sort of writing the theological reflection, I was thinking about one way of thinking of analysing this data is to say, if you took someone from the Church of England, middle of the road Church of England church in 1885, and you sort of planted them in 2024, what sort of would they notice that's similar, and what would they notice that's different if they looked at this data? And actually, I think it's a load of stuff that's similar. And we've already heard, I came to one of the sessions earlier, we talk about the history of church planting and all that kind of stuff in the Church of England. Bishops and archdeacons haven't really changed. Parish is still, as the data shows, still the sort of the mainstay of the Church of England, all of that. But one of the things that is different is this language. What is a new, the language of church replaced by a new worshipping community or new ecclesial community or worshipping community or something like that is new. So what might be a theological direction here? Well, let's talk about this a little bit. So following Mission Shaped Church, which was the big report in the Church of England that really launched so much of our thinking about new missional church, there was a great deal of discussion about the Church of England's ecclesiology. In particular, the questions that seemed most urgent concerned our definition of church. How do we know what is a church and what isn't a church? New things were not new. What was new was the claim that these things be designated as churches. In other words, we always were doing youth projects and outreach projects and stuff. What was new was this idea that this thing is a church. Alan's nightclub, with the young people, that's a church, right? That's the new claim. And the obvious pushback was that these things really were not churches, at least not by any measure previously used within the Church of England. As has been noted elsewhere, Mission Shaped Church drew on a range of sources beyond Anglicanism in order to establish an ecclesiology for the movement of starting new things. It did, however, make central the Apostles' Creed, as well as offering a brief reflection on the sacraments and the episcopacy. What the report marks, however, is a way of answering the question predominantly in the pragmatic. Primarily, given that these new things exist and others are starting, how do we make sense of them as churches? So one of the consequences of this focus is that ecclesiology inadvertently from this point tended to be done in the negative rather than in the positive. That is to say, the question was asked, what's the sort of bare minimum that must be in place in order for this really to be a church? We might call this an ecclesial minimum. And of course, this can be answered in a number of ways, depending on one's ecclesiology. At the same time, Mission Shaped Church is also a product of another theological trend, namely the shift from church as a reality, as a substantive thing, to church as an idea or a concept. And this tendency can be witnessed in much of the theological work that springs from Missio Dei theology, which has been so prominent in the 20th century. In this theology, church is always relativized by a theological commitment to the primacy of God's work of reconciliation. God's mission is primary, and the church is a means to that end. Mission-shaped church was indebted to this way of thinking, and it cites two quotations to that end. The first one, quote, "There is a church because there is mission, not vice versa," and quote, "It's not the church of God that has a mission in the world, but the God of mission who has a church in the world." And very, very significant, those quotations. What happens here then to the concept of church? Well, essentially it results in an inherent fluidity to the being of the church. The church is any form, the church in any one form, is secondary to the mission of the church, which is always primary. The church is the church only to the extent that she participates in mission. It is this participation that makes the church the church. And once that happens, the particularity of church form becomes malleable. Much of the Catholic pushback to mission-shaped church was representative of what was perceived to have been lost here. The counterclaim was that the church can't take different forms, given that the church simply is what the church is. This is the Catholic critique. Namely, that body gathered around word and sacrament under the threefold order of deacon, priest, and bishop, and using the authorized liturgies of the church. Of course, within that, there's possibility of flexibility. However, the point was that we simply cannot pull the idea of church away from the sort of concrete forms that she has taken. What mission-shaped church represents, therefore, is the way in which church in this theological tradition has become a concept divorced from a given form. And this is why we can speak of doing church or being church or becoming church. Once again, the purpose of this report is not to undermine this conception of church or to side with a Catholic vision or evangelical vision. We simply wish to ask whether and how this idea might function within a church, Church of England, which has taken a church form as of central importance throughout its history. A diverse ecclesiology such as we've reported here is surely a new phenomenon for the Church of England. Diversity itself, as we've argued, is nothing new, but the diversity around the basic unit of ecclesial form, church, Christian community, new worshipping community, surely is. One issue is clear, this comes to your point, John. It will be very hard for those from a more Catholic tradition to engage in a movement that has an inherently loose definition of church and church form. This might be one of the reasons why we've not seen a great deal of engagement in starting new churches from Anglo-Catholics. Put simply, if a church is the gathering of those around the word and sacraments as administered by a priest and according to the authorized forms, then, quote, new worshipping community or new Christian community will always be inherently weak as a descriptor. Really, all I'm saying here is, and this is, when we come to the end, what are the suggestions? What's the word? Not suggestions. Recommendations. Thank you. We need more theology. That's what I keep saying. In other words, we just got to spend more time doing this theological work as a church, as a church. So that's number one. Number two, vision, strategy, and culture. As noted above, one feature of the contemporary Church of England is the ubiquitous use of the language of vision, strategy, and culture, along with its various iterations, so culture change, strategic implementation, etc. We suggest that such language and the concepts within it are worthy of theological reflection. There you go. Clearly, the language does not relate specifically to the issue of new things, but there is something particular about starting new churches because it's an intentional act. In other words, when you start something new, rather than a posture of reception, which I guess is the inherited church, the inheritance we receive, when you're starting something new, this language of strategy, in other words, how do we make this thing happen and happen well? Vision, what's being aimed at? Strategy, how do we go about it? And culture, what is it we're establishing? Those words are integral to starting something new in some sense. So church planting, I think, has a particular role in this theological conversation about the language of strategy. Our claim is that if the language and activity remain underexplored, if it lacks theological foundation, then two things are able to happen simultaneously. So in the first place, the language and the activity will just continue to be being used. So people will continue to talk about strategy and vision and culture and implementation, but albeit uncritically, theologically uncritically. And loosed from its theological roots, the conceptual framework inevitably looks for other sources for its guidance, most probably business management theory. As we shall suggest below, borrowing from these areas is not necessarily a problem per se. I want to make that clear. However, it can become so if those fields direct the use of this language and activity. Essentially, what happens is that we stop merely using the tools of those fields, so vision, strategy, culture, and are also driven by their ends. whatever that might be. Alongside this, however, and second, the failure to ground the language and activity within theological foundation inevitably leaves it open to suspicion and misrepresentation from others within the church, who cannot but see the changes affected as necessarily driven by some agenda other than by a theological agenda. This leaves the church, many in the church, unable to engage with this deficient, what they perceive to be a theologically deficient project. And you get all sort of weird things when that happens. We're left with this bizarre situation in which the task of starting a new church itself is perceived to be somehow a rejection of an inheritance, which is itself necessarily an inheritance of starting new churches, right? This is where we get to. So it's critical, therefore, that the church engages theologically with the vision, strategy, culture, language. Now, where might we go with this? And just briefly, this is where we touched on this a little bit earlier, the language of, say, managerialism or corporate nature of our praxis. You hear this a lot and sort of shouted from pages of the Church Times and the Church of England and other parts of the church. You know, the Church of England's SDF, it's managerialism, it's business speak. At core, though, essentially, I think, is a concern that the church loses something of her identity when she adopts agendas and approaches that are alien to her own life. In this instance, what's in view is the possibility that the church becomes so dominated by functionalism and maximization that so characterizes late modern capitalism and free market thinking. And beneath that conversation lies a host of deeper theological issues, most central of which I think is the question of how one conceives of the relationship between the church and the world, and that which we label, I guess, the secular. And, you know, is the church called to be other, separate, distant, think of the likes of Stanley Hauerwas, etc., or in some sense is there the possibility of an engagement with that sphere with different ends? So one thing I think, though, that the church will have to wrestle with, and this is where we can't really move beyond the language of strategy, vision, and culture, is simply how it makes sense of the fact that things can be done well and can be done badly. And that's true of inherited churches and new churches. You know, that's the question, isn't it? Why is it that things can be done well, and why is it that things can be done really badly? In other words, we have to at some point think about human agency in this conversation, and that's where theologically, I think at least there's ground to talk about strategy, vision, and culture, and all the rest of it. I've got a long piece here. I won't go into it now just because of time, about means and ends. I think that's really key. We get that right. We think about the means and the ends, but also just to dig into a little bit more about this idea of how things can be done well. I've heard, I think, Mark, you might have spoken about this before around, you know, just asking the question, why do certain things work and other things don't? You know, in our worship settings, for example, we wouldn't be afraid to ask that question. You know, why is it a certain piece of music or a certain piece of liturgy moves people in a certain way? That's that's an intentional act that we expect to have or imagine might have possibility of certain outcomes. There's all sorts of theological space, I think, for us to explore about that in a way that allows for the freedom of God, in other words, mystery, so that we don't presume that if we act in certain ways, God is going to do certain things, but allows for us to say that when we act in certain ways, it gives a particular space within which God can do a particular thing, right? And we need some way, I think, theologically of making sense of this. Otherwise, as I say, our language gets lost. And I was thinking about this week because Durham diocese, this diocese here, just last week was awarded 8 million, I think, 7-8 million, 8 million pounds. That's public now, isn't it? 8 million to do various projects. And I was thinking about how do we as a church receive news like that? How do we receive the fact that we've got 8 million pounds to spend on mission? Now, in one sense, you want to sort of jump from the rafters and celebrate it. But another part of us think, well, why? What is our theological theory of change there? And I keep asking this question. It's in that report a little bit as well. What do we think money does? Like, what do we think money does theologically? And I don't think we've quite grasped that nettle yet. I don't think we've quite thought about that. If what we say about God is true, then the question of money is immediately relativized. And these are the sort of theological questions that from this research, I think we really need to be asking. Okay, third thing is about resourcing churches need for theological reflection. Get that. this is short, this one. 8 dioceses use the language of resource or resourcing church. No clear definition was given across the churches. There wasn't a shared definition. There wasn't kind of the one place that people were going to. Resource or resourcing churches, just to let you know, others in the room will be far more got far more to say on this than me. But essentially, the vision was that you would have bigger churches, almost in a kind of Minster model, that would be given additional resources, people, money, and that would kind of hopefully through church planting and grafting, but also just the sort of bleeding, I guess, into the ecosystem, would have influence and significance. And in one sense, it was just to capture something that has always happened in the church ecology, which is that you have bigger churches and you have smaller churches, and there's some sort of symbiosis between the two. So, but yes, it's just interesting to point out that there isn't a shared language of what resourcing churches is when we pushed in interviews across those 11 dioceses, and yet 8 of those churches, those dioceses, were saying it's really important that we do this, and we think it's a really good thing. So what the report does is just go through, okay, well, what might some of the theological questions we might want to ask about resourcing churches, what might those questions be, and what might be some of those sources, where might we go to find that stuff? And that's all in the report. So we'll look at that. Church in Antioch, for example, as a resourcing church, Minster churches, 10th, 11th century, yeah, all of that, so you can read about that. And the final thing is this language of pioneers and planters. And I wanted to land here because I think when I think about the gathering last year, this was quite a significant theme, I think, that we had in the room, and those of us who have been involved in what we traditionally call sort of church planting or grafting, and then those of us who might have been involved in pioneering and fresh expressions. And just to sort of give away the game, I very much feel those things belong together. That's what was one of the things that came out for me last year. But this language is important. So what I think we find from the data is that we have seen a shift in the espoused and the operant theology since Mission Shaped Church. Mission Shaped Church, 2003, 2004, big emphasis on fresh expressions and pioneering. When you talk to these 11 dioceses and those individuals now, where's the SDF money going? It's going into church planting and grafting. So that's what the data shows quite clearly, I think. So just to offer a little background on that, as I say, fresh expressions, Mission Shaped Church together. So pioneering was the way to go after Mission Shaped Church. In 2016, there was something like 2,100 of these fresh expressions in existence. In infancy, fresh expressions was really about starting new things, new missional churches. But over time, the terminology became much tighter. So rather than sort of a catch-all term, it became to distinguish a particular type of way of starting new missional church. The closest someone has come for delineating between these different types, theologically, I think, is Michael Moyner, who was here last year. And Michael suggested that there are 2 models when it comes to starting new churches, what he called worship first and serve first. Worship first and serve first. The former, serve first, is the pioneering approach. And serve first is about listening and responding to what one finds in the context so that church emerges from the context one finds oneself within and from the people encountered. So it's inherently and deeply contextual, that's the point. In contrast, Michael Moyner's worship-first approach most resembles what we'd call classic church planting. It's about forming church from day one as a first rather than a second step. And he calls it worship first because his point is, in a serve first journey, you meet people where they're at, you spend time with them, church emerges and worship emerges sort of somewhere down the line. It might take a long, long time to get there. Whereas worship first, you turn up day one with your team and you're worshipping either liturgically or charismatically, doesn't matter, but you're worshipping from day one. Now, since Mission Shaped Church, the Church of England has been on a journey with all this. And as I say, the research suggests that where we are now, most of the new things that are being started look far more like Moyner's worship first approach rather than the serve first approach. In an independent review of strategic development funding, for example, 94 of the projects that were awarded SDF funding, 37 of those 94 were about or connected to starting resourcing churches or helping large churches to become resourcing churches, with over half of all funding going in some sense towards these projects. So in other words, church planting, basically. That's where the money was going in a big way. And only one of the dioceses that I spent time with out of these 11 really was investing significant time, energy, and I guess giving a platform in the diocese to fresh expressions explicitly. One out of the 11, which is interesting. So what to say about this? Well, on the one hand, the research does suggest that although people weren't explicitly talking about fresh expressions anymore, actually what was going on was a kind of subsummation, a sort of a swallowing up of all of these things under these ecclesial descriptors. So the reason that people were using things like new worshiping communities or new church communities or something like that, new congregations, was as a way of saying, yeah, it can look like church plant or it can look like fresh expressions. And you know what, it doesn't really matter. It's just a new thing, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so that was why the language was being used. So you could sort of look at it and say, you know, it doesn't really matter. And it's interesting that you look at something like CCX, a Centre for Church Multiplication and Growth, very much started out, I guess, out of an HTB resourcing church planting model. In more recent times, they've subsumed within that fresh expressions, and they've got like a pioneer track now within that. Okay. I mean, the thing to ask really is, does any of this matter? I think there's a variety of ways of answering that question. The first is to say, given that the Church of England remains, at least in its espoused theology, it does remain committed to pioneering the fresh expressions. I think it's worth asking the question as sort of a matter of integrity, really, first of all. Second, I think it's worth exploring because I find this conversation, planting, pioneering, really sort of theologically generative. I find it really interesting about how we do mission, our theology, our ecclesiology, and all the rest of it. So I just want to sort of talk into that. So my sense is that rather than perpetuate a divide between those two ways of doing mission, the deeply contextual, the serve first and the worship first, it might be better just to think about some of the theological instincts that are at play and establish what will be important to hold fast to. The danger is that the model sort of perpetuates a way of conceiving something without analysing and assessing the theological instincts underneath it. So as I say, on the whole, the pioneering approach emphasises the importance of contextualisation. Negatively stated, it's working really hard against what it perceives to be a colonial approach to starting new churches, in which a model or system is sort of imposed from the outside upon a new context. What is sought instead is this journey of listening and responding. And in this sense, pioneering is really about a certain posture to missional practice, one that is marked really by humility. It makes sense in that sense of the Church of England's strong commitment to locality through the parish system, of being close to where people are and responding to that which one finds. If you wanted a really good book on that, Ben Quash, theologian's got a book called Found Theology, and he does a really good job of explaining, you know, that posture of humility, really, and responding to what one finds. It's essentially a theology of receptivity, I guess. The planting model, on the other hand, holds worship as primary. The sense here is that it's impossible to conceive of church theologically without recourse to worship. Arguably, worship is not simply the first thing that the church does, as though it had a list of sort of tasks that it must complete, but is definitive. Worship is definitive of her very existence. She is that which worships the Father of Jesus Christ in the power of the Spirit. I'll say that again. The church is that which worships the Father of Jesus Christ in the power of the Spirit. In his book Holiness, the theologian John Webster argues that since the church is what she is only by God's grace, she must therefore be shaped by a certain posture. This is the quote. Quote, the church is what it is by grace. There is accordingly a proper passivity to the being of church for faith. That is recognition and assent and trust in the work of God is the fundamental act of the church's existence. Faith is the fundamental act of the church's existence. Comes back to the stuff that Alan was saying earlier, I think, that church happens as response to that event of the gospel, right? It's God's grace, in other words, his empowering presence. The church is that which results. And then John Webster says, because of this posture of passivity, in other words, as people of faith who simply receive what God is doing, worship must necessarily play a central role. He says this, quote, praise is the great act of rebellion against sin, the great repudiation of our wicked refusal to acknowledge God to be the Lord. In sum, therefore, the church is holy as, day by day, it magnifies God and worships his name, ever world without end. And this is core to the Church of England's understanding of the church, I think, that the church is simply a congregation which gathers around word and sacrament, Article 19 of the Articles. Historically, it's often stated that the church's orthodoxy has been inexorably tied to her orthopraxy, lex oriendi, lex credendi, hence the central place of the prayer book in the Church of England. Given this, it should be of little surprise that the Church of England would revert, almost as an instinct, towards a way of imagining new things that centres on the gathered worshipping congregation. I wonder if theologically that's what we sort of see is going on. I'll say that again. It's not a surprise that the Church of England would revert, almost as an instinct, towards a way of imagining new things that centres on the gathered worshipping congregation. It's sort of her DNA. And I could talk about the strengths and weaknesses of those different missional approaches as seen pragmatically. The question for the Church of England is, perhaps I'd suggest tentatively, whether and how it can maintain the instincts of both approaches within its ecclesial forms and structures so that it avoids the dangers that I've talked about. This could happen through mixed ecology, through a variety of church forms. However, it also might attempt to establish how it might be that each church as a local body is incorporating the instincts of both. What does a mature planting or grafting look like, which takes account of the pioneering instincts? Is it possible, on the same note, to imagine pioneering churches which hold worship, word and sacrament, as the very core of all they do?